Hi everyone, this is English 241 Early American Literature, and today I want to talk to you about early American fiction and slavery.
So, in your unit, you have a website called Slavery in the United States, and here are just some of the highlights from that website. Even states with a low slave-holding population profited from the labor of slaves. By 1850, 80% of American exports came from slave labor. The estimated value of enslaved people increased 500% between 1790 and 1860, from 200 million to around 3.59 billion. Slavery's profitability far outweighed the moral outrage it caused. And this is important. This data is important because when you have to understand slavery in the context of economics, it was an economic issue as well as a civil rights issue, but it began as an economic issue, and that's what the war was primarily about, was economics. Excuse me. 4 million people were freed by the 13th Amendment. And this is just the 13th Amendment for those of you that aren't familiar with it. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. The 13th Amendment is important because as we go through history, you will see that a lot of African Americans, a lot of blacks were convicted of crimes that their white counterparts would not be convicted of, for the sole reason of turning them into slaves, because servitude is legal if it is a form of punishment. The next one of your background readings is the mere distinction of color. And it's an interesting website, and I put it up there because it talks about some archaeological work that's being done at Mount Pelier, which is the home of James Madison. And just if you don't remember, James Madison, president, signer of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, certainly one of the most important thinkers in America. Thomas Jefferson had great respect for James Madison, felt that he was one of the most brilliant minds of America. And Paul Jennings is a manservant of James Madison. He served James Madison, took care of him, dressed him, cared for him when he was ill. He was present when Madison died. And he is important when we're looking at the literature of early America because he wrote the very first White House memoir. He really did a tell-all, shall we say, of his time working for, enslaved by James Madison. And it's really an interesting read. It's not long. I got a copy of it. I went to visit Mount Pelier, and I got a copy of it there. It's quite interesting to read. He had quite a really interesting life and really knew a lot. As you might expect, because he was a slave, people said a lot of things in front of him that they might not have said in front of someone who was not a slave. But because he was a slave, he got the inside scoop on a lot of things. So it's an interesting read. I think this is funny. He bought his freedom on the installment plan, so he paid for his own freedom eventually. And he was a really important leader of the African American community in D.C. once he was freed. So, what's the relevance of slavery today? Why is it our responsibility to talk about what happened? And what impact does slavery have on us today? And I think these are really important questions because a lot of times when you're going back and you're looking at history, people will say that you need to understand history so that you don't repeat it. And I don't think that the South is going to uh, import slaves anytime soon. Um, and I don't feel like we have to be concerned that slavery is going to come back into the United States, at least not slavery in the historical way that we understand it. But I think it's important to understand or to think about slavery because it has had such a grave impact on our identity. It certainly is, if you think about our readings about the other and about Native Americans, it certainly does represent another terrible example of us treating people who are different in really negative, horrific ways. And this quote, again from that website, is: "We live with the legacy of slavery every day." And we really do, whether it be, I mean, whether you're, particularly if you are a brown person in the United States today, you live with the legacy of slavery. But as a Caucasian person in the United States, you still live with the legacy of slavery. We have so many issues with equality and with respect, and these can be at least tangentially related, if not directly related, to the legacy of slavery. I would go back even further and say that it's related to how America was created, how the very foundation that we were built upon seems to me to be one that took economic advantage of anyone that was thought to be less than a white European. And and so we still have ramifications of that very much today in so many different ways. I mean, we could spend a whole semester talking about this, uh, but just, just one quick and easy way to think about it is um, how racism and prejudice has been perpetuated, certainly deeply ingrained in us, but perpetuated with slavery. And you can see the offshoots of that in what happens with our incarceration rates of African American men, with the arrest rates of people of color. So certainly the ramifications of slavery are something that we deal with, whether we're aware of it or not, really on a daily basis. The Fugitive Slave Act was again another part of your background reading. And these were statutes passed by Congress in 1793 and 1850 and repealed in 1864. These dates are important and you'll see why shortly. And they provided for the seizure and return of runaway slaves who escaped from one state into another or into a federal territory. So if they went out west, even though that wasn't a state, they still could be seized and returned to their owners. In 1793, the law enforced Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution and authorizing any federal district judge or circuit court judge or any state magistrate to decide finally and without a jury trial the status of an alleged fugitive slave. So in other words, They may have been freed by their owners, but if they were picked up as an alleged fugitive slave, they were returned to slavery, and they had no rights to any kind of trial. Next is Spencer's sermon in response to the Fugitive Slave Act. And I think that this is a particularly important piece of reading because he seems to be, when you're first reading the piece, he seems to be understanding and supportive of those other religious factions who have come out against the Fugitive Slave Act. But as you get more and more into his sermon and towards the end, you see that he, in fact, absolutely supports it and does not see it as something that a good American can in any way not support. And so just a quote, and this is on page 12 of the sermon, which I think is about 20 pages long. When men are submitted to human government, they are not to consider themselves as merely carrying out the implied conditions of social compact, but their duty is to consider themselves as submitting to an ordinance of their God and Maker. Human government is of a more high and solemn character than the mere idea of a social compact would make it. So a social compact, that concept is that men gather together, they have a social compact, social contract might be another way of understanding it. And what that does is that we agree that if we're going to work together, we have to have laws that govern us. And Spencer is saying that no, laws are more than that. Laws come from God. And so he says, I am only insisting upon religious obedience to law. So in other words, what he is saying is that if you are a good Christian, you are going to follow the law, all right? And he gives these reasons for what you must do. You must be aware of the influence of mere feeling, okay? Be aware of prejudice. Do not make up your minds under impulse or without extensive information. Study it religiously. Cultivate the spirit of Jesus Christ. Feel as he felt, act as he acted. Be obedient to the laws of your land. Be peaceful, law-abiding citizens. And this is important, I think, a particularly important piece of literature because what he is saying, it seems, at least to me, my reading of it is, don't just act on feeling, but use your logic and your reason to make good decisions about whether you should be obedient to a law, whether it's a just law. But he says, don't make up your minds under impulse or without extensive information. So again, do your research, know what it is that you are deciding upon. Study it religiously. When he says study it religiously, he doesn't mean study it hard, but he means study it from the religious aspects, as in that laws are created by God. And then this is the part to me that is probably the most problematic from his sermon is cultivate the spirit of Jesus Christ. Feel as he felt, act as he acted. And Spencer is known as, being very pro-slavery. And so this line is particularly problematic to me because at least my understanding of the Bible, my understanding of Jesus Christ, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that, Jesus would not have supported slavery. He would not have supported cruelty. He would not have supported treating people as less than human. And certainly that's what we see with slavery. So I feel like Spencer's sermon is kind of sneaky and it's a really good piece of rhetoric. But he comes to this whole concept of, you have to obey the laws because God sets down the laws and men enact those laws. And again, I think this is problematic um, when you start talking about feeling as Jesus felt and act as Jesus acted, because I don't think that there's anything in my reading, at least, or understanding of Christianity or the Bible that would suggest that brutality was an acceptable way to treat a human being. I certainly don't see that as being something that Jesus would have done or purported. So the next piece of important writing that we come to in this background is the Emancipation Proclamation. And that was made by President Abraham Lincoln. And this is important because there's a little bit more background to it. A lot of people have conflicting understandings of Lincoln. And my understanding, my reading, my history, or my research has indicated that there is no argument, there is no way that Lincoln supported slavery. And this is, in fact, a quote from him. If slavery were not wrong, then nothing is wrong. So he does not believe in slavery. However, he is a lawyer, and he, as president, he's sworn to uphold the Constitution. And he, as a lawyer and president, can find no constitutional reason to make slavery illegal. It's not against the Constitution. And this is really important because he wants to do the right thing, but he feels that he is bound by law and the Constitution and cannot change it. So he desperately tries to find a way out of slavery, a way to make it illegal. And so the way that he comes to this is that because of his executive authority as President of the United States, and we are at war with the South, the slaves were used to support the Confederate cause, to build trenches, to make camps, to cook and serve the soldiers, to manage and deliver goods. And so, because of this, because they were tools of war, then he determines that he has the executive authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is just an excerpt from it. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states, which he lists all of the states that have slaves, and part of states, are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. So he basically makes a presidential proclamation that these tools of war shall be free. And he goes on to say, I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared, i.e. the slaves, to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. He also goes on to say that, and part of the reason that he finds slaves being forced to work for the Confederates is that they're being forced to work for the very people who have enslaved them against those who are seeking their freedom. And he suggests, if you read further into the proclamation, that the enslaved, now that they are free, come to the northern side and work for us. Fight for the people who are also fighting for your freedom, and you'll be paid for doing so. So it's kind of a sneaky thing, and there's lots of different layers to it. He's not just freeing the slaves, he's also recruiting them to come and work for him. Um, you can't talk about a unit about slavery in American literature without talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And frequently in the past, I've had this unit where we read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this is kind of hard to do in the summer. Number one, and number two, as I started thinking about it, Uncle Tom's Cabin is written by a white woman. And so I just redesigned this unit because I thought, wouldn't it be important to read about slavery from people who actually experienced it, and who um, it was their life, rather than a white woman's take on slavery. Now, certainly, um, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was well renowned. It still is an important piece of American literature, and I don't want to in any way diminish its value or importance in American literature. I just felt like if we're going to talk about slavery, we needed to get the perspective of the slaves. But it's important, it's still important to mention it, and it's kind of important to see what its purpose was and to kind of situate it in American literature, because it was a very popular novel. It sold very well, but it had some primary purposes. She was writing for didactic purposes, and for those of you not familiar with that term, she was writing to prove a point, to persuade you to believe something, and it served as propaganda for the cause of anti-slavery. So she was really an abolitionist, and she wanted to make sure that people understood why slavery was so bad and just how insidious it was. So you might see a sermon type preachy tone when you're reading it. She sees this as a moral issue. She doesn't see it as economic. She doesn't see it as practical. She doesn't see it as political. She sees this purely from a Christian perspective, and that this is a moral issue of right and wrong. And so really that's the value of this particular piece of early American literature. Some themes in the novel. She details the hardships of slaves that slaves faced in everyday life, the extreme danger of escaping, and the sacrifices that they made. And she does this for the purpose, again, didactic purposes, to show just how wrong slavery is. She shows how slavery divides families, robs people of their own self-determination, their ability to determine their life and their well-being. And she tries humanizing the slaves. And this is, again, hugely important because up to this point, we are not seeing that in literature. And think back to Mary Rowlandson and how she presented the Native Americans. She was not humanizing Native Americans. And this is the same thing with writing about African Americans and slaves. Up until Stowe, we are not humanizing them. They are objects, they are things, they are possessions, they are less than. So they're not people who have rights and deserve to be respected until we get to Stowe. So that's really important to see that that's the first time in American literature that this happens. And again, just talking about being subhuman, she proves that that slaves have lives, that they have human emotions, that they have religion and faith, and she often depicts their faith as being stronger than those of the whites, that they have strong survival instincts and they yearn for freedom and self-determination, that they have strong family ties, that they have a spiritual community, and that they're able to sacrifice for others, not just for themselves, that they are indeed just as human as the Europeans, that they are caring, loving individuals that deserve our respect. And if we are good Christians, that we will give them that respect that they deserve. And so this is just astounding in American literature at this point. So in this unit, we've got our background readings. I've told you a little bit about the relevance of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what we do then is we read a few slave narratives, some excerpts from some famous, really profoundly influential African Americans who are writing and speaking and touring, talking to others during this time. So slave narratives are extremely an influential tradition in African American culture and literature. So they really help define what an African American is, that identity, that history. And more slave narratives than novels are written in America up until the 1920s. So not only is it an important part of American culture, it's also a very popular part of American culture. And we see a lot of them being written. And they also, there can be a strong argument made that these slave narratives strongly influenced really classical literature, American literature like Huckleberry Finn, The Confessions of Nat Turner, and Toni Morrison's Beloved. We can all see the relevance and the value of the slave narrative in all of these pieces. This genre really helped to shape our future American literature. So slave narratives and their fictional descendants have played a major role in national debates about slavery, freedom, and American identity, and have challenged the conscience and the historical consciousness of the United States ever since its founding. And this is important to know, that the impact that slave narratives have had on what we consider really important American literature. So it's not simply a culture talking about its history. This is our culture talking about our history. And it's really integral for us to understand how we are deeply connected to these narratives. So, slave narratives are an important means of opening a dialogue between blacks and whites about slavery and freedom. If we're talking about the narrative, it's always uncomfortable to talk about slavery. It's always uncomfortable to talk about racism. But when we look at it as a text that takes some of those personal feelings, it allows us to better understand, regardless of our skin color and of our background, where the horror of slavery. Slave narratives are designed to enlighten white readers. They were very popular in America and in Britain, and it is to let them know about the realities of slavery as an institution and about the humanity of Black people who deserve full human rights. It's often dismissed as anti-slavery propaganda. So, oh, that's just a slave narrative. It's, because they're anti-slavery. But really, again, they're super, super popular in the United States and Great Britain. So it seems to me that they're more important than that. And they continue to be relevant in today's literature and historical curricula. We study slave narratives. You may have frequently, depending on where you went to high school, you may have read slave narratives. You may have done reports on slave narratives. and certainly you're doing so now. So it is an important aspect of literature, of American literature. Slave narratives also chronicle the evolution of white supremacy in the South from 18th century slavery through early 20th century segregation and disenfranchisement. So it's a way to look at how this concept of white supremacy has been allowed to grow by looking at the slave narratives. They also portray slavery as a condition of extreme physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual deprivation, a kind of hell on earth. And it's really important. And when I say things like this, I get students to say, yeah, but some slaves were treated really well. Yeah, some may have been, but there's no getting around the fact that people were owned and treated as property. And that really is dehumanizing. When you do that, you are taking the humanity away from someone when you own them. And certainly when we look at the suffragist movement, women had this issue. Women were property. We didn't have the right to vote. We didn't have the right to own property. We could only do what our husband told us to do. So certainly these issues of being property are not just, it doesn't mean that you're treated horrifically, although in many, many cases the slaves were, and women were as well. But that's a whole nother lecture. Anyway, I just want you to understand or try to imagine what it would be like to be owned by someone, to have someone tell you when you ate, have someone tell you when you could go to the bathroom, what you could wear, when you could stand up, when you could sit down, where you worked, how long you worked, how hard you worked. And if at any time you disobeyed, had the legal right to beat you to death, that's something that I think is so far removed from our reality that it's really hard for us to understand. And I think that by reading the slave narratives, it helps us to get an inkling, just a bare inkling, of what it was like to be owned and to be property. Another aspect of a slave narrative is that when the slave usually undertakes an arduous quest for freedom, and that ends in the slave's arrival in the North. Excuse me. And this freedom is signaled by renaming of oneself. So frequently the slaves, when they were freed, named themselves something else. Frederick Douglass did that. Harriet, oh gosh, I can't think of her name, but Harriet that we're reading, she renamed herself as well. So people will frequently rename themselves kind of as an act of independence. I'm no longer this person's property with this name, I'm now this one. And many, many, many of the slave narratives, you will see that the freed slaves turn to anti-slavery activism as a way to kind of self-actualize and to become the person that they want to be. So the first slave narrative that you're reading an excerpt from is the interesting narrative of the life of Elijah Equiano. And this was written in 1789. And Equiano is a West African slave. He was captured in West Africa, and he his narrative tries to educate British readers on the richness of his African culture. So he begins his story with how sophisticated his culture was, his homeland, his life. He writes about coming from a very wealthy family. And he does this to impress on British readers his humanity, his humanness. And then he also talks about the violence and the horror of captivity, the denial of the human right to move freely is a huge theme in this piece. he himself moves from sort of ignorance or naivete to knowledge to a better understanding. And you can see this with his kind of religious conversion. He's baptized relatively early into Christianity. However, he doesn't really get it or get into it until he has a near-death experience, and then he really begins studying Christianity in earnest. And he concludes, he at first thinks that all white men are evil, but as he begins his study into Christianity, he concludes that slavery is what makes men evil. It's not their skin color, but rather their deeds, their actions. The next piece that you're going to read is by Harriet Jacobs, and it's Incidents of a Slave Girl, written by herself. And Harriet Jacobs is the first woman to author a fugitive slave narrative in the United States. So she is the first one. This is really important because women don't do this, but she does. She represents an African American woman's resourcefulness, courage, and dauntless quest for freedom. She fights like nothing. I would strongly recommend reading this if you have the opportunity. If once class is over, you want a good summer read. It's really very well written, and it's quite interesting, and it really shows her tenacity, and it's an important piece for women's rights, but it's also an important slave narrative. And one of the things that she brings up, being a woman, that others don't in their slave narratives, is how the Southern patriarchy has used sexual tyranny over Black women. I mean, the rape, the sexual slavery, just the horrible way that women especially were victimized even more so. I mean, both were commodities regardless of your gender, but you were at your owner's, your male owner's whim for whatever he wanted. She wants very much to support the anti-slavery cause, and she wants to present herself as an agent of change rather than a victim. She is not spending time feeling sorry for herself in this novel. In fact, she relays the events that happened to her very carefully, so that she doesn't look like a terrible victim, but rather than someone who perseveres and conquers and moves forward in her life, and eventually does earn or win her freedom because of a nice white woman, basically. But it's a good read. Both of these pieces are considered autobiographical. However, they're not told. They're not I mean, they are autobiographical. They're based on true events, but they're not written as such. They're written as fictional pieces. So even though they seem autobiographical, they are fictional. They use different names. They are written for a very express purpose of persuading the reader to experience and feel and think very specific things, and that's important to keep in mind when reading these pieces. Next, probably one of the most famous African American orators and writers of the 19th century is Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery at the age of 20. He was over in Maryland, just down the street, not far from where we are now. He published 3 books about his life in slavery, and he published a lot more. These are just 3 different books that he wrote. Probably the most famous is The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. That's the one that usually in high schools you read, or you read excerpts from. I didn't give us any excerpts from his slave narratives. I decided to pick something a little bit different, and you'll see that in just a moment. He also edited the most influential black newspaper of the 19th century, and he was internationally renowned. He traveled all over speaking and about slavery, about the brutality of slavery, the moral wrongness of slavery uh, throughout. Once he became free, and that was really super amazingly brave of him. I mean, that was not. He could have been so easily jailed or captured and taken back, but he was really very high profile, and that took an amazing amount of bravery and courage on his part. So what you're reading from him is the meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro. And I love this piece because to me, it pokes at the irony of slavery. So just like we were in the last unit, we were talking about, or one of your discussion board posts was about how, we're going through this age of reason, and we're using logic and reason to understand the world around us and science, and yet we're dehumanizing these Native Americans. And so he really does um, basically address that specifically when he uh, has this speech about the meaning of the 4th of July to the Negro. Because there is no such thing, obviously, as independence. And so I'll just read just a teensy bit here. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impotence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, and with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast. So, in other words, what he's saying is that you guys are fakes. This is not real. You're not real Christians. You don't believe in freedom. You only believe in it for a certain population. So basically, you're a hypocrite. And he really calls this out publicly. He publicly professes this. And this is hugely brave. It's true, but it's nonetheless hugely brave on his part. Finally, we end with Sojourner Truth, which I spelled her name wrong. Sorry about that, guys. That she is particularly interesting because she was illiterate. Um, Up until the other authors that you're reading actually did write their work, they were taught to read and write. But Sojourner Truth never learned to read and write. So she was still a really important literary figure because she is an itinerant preacher. She goes around traveling and public speaker. Again, she's talking about the feminist movement. She's talking about women's rights and the African American women. She suggests that the adversities of slavery have prepared her for spiritual trials in a way that white preachers cannot understand. So, in other words, all of the hardships that she's endured, um, the, the white preachers who talk about what it means to be a good Christian, they really can't understand because they haven't endured what she has endured. So that's really kind of important, a way of looking at it. So she brings a unique perspective. She also does something, she is a literary figure, not just a public speaker, because she tells her story, and her story is written down. And she does this because she sees that Frederick Douglass has this great success and a very renowned public figure. And so she wants some of his success too. She wants to have a home of her own. She wants to be independent. And so she has her story, she tells her story, and it's published. And she does, in fact, she is able to buy a home and spend the rest of her life relatively comfortably. So she did um, accomplish what she set out to accomplish by telling her story. I wouldn't say that her story is as popular, as well known as Frederick Douglass, but at that time it certainly was quite renowned. So she's definitely an important figure, a major figure in the slave narrative genre. So that concludes this lecture. A couple of things that I want to say. When one of the, I think it's, I can't remember if it's your reading journal or your discussion board post, but I ask you to look at how the role of Christianity in the Native American subjugation and the slavery's subjugation. And what I don't want you to do uh, is to try to compare one as being worse than the other or more horrific than the other. Certainly to those specific populations, their experiences were horrific in and of themselves. And so I'm not trying, I don't want you to say, oh, the Native Americans had it worse than the African American slaves. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, what did the role of Christianity have to do in both the subjugation of these people and the freedom of these people, winning the freedom of these people? So, for example, you might look at how Woolman worked to end slavery, whereas somebody like Spencer worked to promote slavery. And so they're two different contradicting Christian perspectives of what's right and wrong. And certainly we see that with the Native Americans as well. So that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to compare or contrast the horrors that these populations faced, but rather the role of Christianity in their experiences. So, that being said, that's all I have for now. I'll be back in touch real soon. If you have questions and comments, you know where to post them. See you later. Bye.